Good evening, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the BAC. If this is your first time visiting us, to everybody in the room, to Cass Hall. Welcome to all of our visitors who are at their own homes, zooming in. And I am delighted to introduce our speaker this evening for the inaugural fall lecture series. The fall lecture series is titled Just Narratives. And my name is Jay Davis Hart, and I am the director and faculty of the Design for Human Health Masters of Design Studies program here at the BAC. And I will turn my spotlight to our guest speaker, whose name is Hannah Wong. She is a designer and a maker. She is constantly navigating her place in the world of art, space, and social change. Her design and research practice centers around the physical and social belonging of people with disabilities in the public realm. She is the founder of Demarcation, a social enterprise focused on providing detailed accessibility information to disabled users of public space and design recommendations for improvement of these spaces. She is an adjunct faculty member in the Design for Human Health MDS program at the BAC. Now, Hannah is a recent graduate of the Harvard Graduate School of Design with a master's in architecture. And even more notably, Hannah is the first legally blind student to attend and graduate from the GSD. While she was there, she founded Design Able, a student-run organization focused on dismantling ableism in design through education, and also served as a founding member of the Student Accessibility Advisory Group, which is a committee of students that Harvard University Disability Resources, which is an accessibility-related policies and activities. Now, beyond the GSD, Hannah has been recognized for her work on remarcation through the 2024 Adrian Cheng Fellowship at Social Innovation and Change Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School, and as a finalist in the Social Enterprise track of the 2025 New Venture Competition at Harvard Business School. In addition, Hannah has worked for the Critical Design Lab as the project manager of the Critical Access Primer for the Human and Planetary Health Group at the GSD, as a researcher on indoor air quality, for the Institute for Human-Centered Design on accessibility in the architectural and digital realms, for Transsolar Climate Engineering on thermal comfort and sustainability, and for Creator IQ, formerly Tribe Dynamics, as a data analyst and DEI consultant. She holds a BA in Applied Mathematics with a concentration in Civil Engineering from UC Berkeley, and I am pleased and delighted to bring Hannah Wong to the podium.
Thanks, Davis. Sorry you had to read all that. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to Davis, Karen, Yufan, and the rest of the BAC team for giving me the honor of presenting this talk entitled Mismatch: How Bodies and Spaces Come Together. As the first in BAC's fall public lecture series. My name is Hannah, and as Davis mentioned, I am an adjunct faculty member at the BAC, as well as the founder of an organization called Remarcation, which I will be speaking about tonight. My pronouns are she, her, and for a visual description, I am a short Asian American woman with albinism, wearing a long green dress and orange neon heels. Thank you for joining us here tonight, both in person and online, as we kick off this series of lectures entitled Just Narratives. When I was first presented with this theme, I immediately began to dissect two of the many meanings of the word just. Just meaning in relation to justice, something that is moral or right, and also just meaning simply, only, or no more than. I want to embrace these two meanings tonight. As I speak from my perspective as a disabled person, this lecture is a just narrative in the sense that my work is a celebration of disability justice and of the disabled community, which has long been intersectionally marginalized with other underrepresented populations. However, my story is also just narrative in the sense that I am one person telling one story, who just happened to be given the privilege of taking the stage in front of you tonight. I am just one person of a larger movement shaped by the work of countless disabled activists, thinkers, and creators who came before me. What you hear tonight is not an all-encompassing story of disability, but simply one thread in a much larger tapestry. My perspective can never encompass the full breadth of the disabled experience, and nor should it. Instead, I hope this just narrative becomes one of many, held alongside others, so that together our stories can form something more complete, more representative, and more just. Before we continue, I would just like to acknowledge that the land on which Boston Architectural College stands is situated on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts people. I understand that this acknowledgement is only a single small step towards restorative justice and the repair of the harmful legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and dispossession of Indigenous peoples. As we think about space and the body tonight, I want to acknowledge that access in relation to land is often through resource extraction and dispossession, and that certain bodies are put at greater harm than others through resource segregation, surveillance, violence, and policing. As we move toward a more accessible world, I want to consider the ways in which we can put accessibility in solidarity with anti-colonial and anti-white supremacy struggles, particularly those led by Black and Indigenous peoples. In accordance with our accessible practices, I would like to challenge the need for silence and stillness in a professional, academic, public environment. I invite audience members to please move, speak, and position themselves in a way that is most comfortable to them throughout the night. To start my narrative tonight, I want to take you back to my arrival in Boston, where I was the first legally blind student to attend Harvard's Graduate School of Design. What you're seeing now is a picture of the trays, the areas that hold our workstations. When I arrived, the stairs were unmarked, and I made what I thought was a simple request to building services to put contrasting edging on the stair noses so that I could see them. It turns out that request wasn't as simple as I thought it would be. They put white masking tape on the edge of the stairs, in which they described as a temporary solution, as you can see in the picture. But 4 years later, I've graduated and the tape is still there. When Harvard, supposedly the best architecture school in the world, can't make a simple accommodation, what does that say about disability in architecture? But first, I want to talk about what I mean by disability. As with any identity, it has multiple complex meanings. One of the ways in which we define disability is through the medical model, which, according to the Center for Disease Control, states that a disability is any condition of the body or mind, an impairment, that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities, activity limitations, and interact with the world around them, participation restrictions. This model focuses on the body as the problem. On the screen is Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, a symbol of what the Renaissance believed to be the ideal human archetype. We have long been obsessed with obtaining perfection in our bodies, and disability was seen as an inherent flaw, or at least outside of the average. One of the more modern models, however, is called the social model of disability. The World Health Organization describes disability as the result of the interaction between individuals with a health condition, such as cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, or depression, with personal and environmental factors, such as negative attitudes, inaccessible public transportation and buildings, and limited social support. On the screen right now is Hunters Point Library by Stephen Hall Architects. The building was heavily criticized upon its opening in 2019 because of its stairs. Not because stairs themselves are inherently bad, but because the stairs were the only way to access certain materials. And if you couldn't use the stairs because of a health condition or mobility device, you were out of luck. So in this case, is the person disabled or is the building disabling? Today, we understand disability more broadly than ever. On the screen is the disability pride flag with a charcoal background and 5 diagonal stripes in red, yellow, white, blue, and green, stretching from the upper left to the bottom right corner of the flag. Each of these stripes represents a different category of disability. Red for physical, yellow for cognitive or intellectual, white for undiagnosed or invisible, blue for emotional or psychiatric, and green for sensory. Under such a broad range of conditions, can we really assert that disability is abnormal? In fact, because of advancements in modern medicine, the question is no longer if somebody is disabled or not, but rather when you will become disabled as a result of old age. With the prevalence of disability, it can't possibly be seen as an exception or uncommon for disabled mind bodies to be seen as normal. So that's why, along with other many scholars in disability and design, I view disability as a mismatch. It's a way in which bodies and spaces come together where neither is wrong, but it's rather just a fitting that isn't quite right. But wait, what about accessible buildings? Aren't they supposed to work for disabled bodies and minds? Well, I first want to talk about what access means in this context. So, though access can mean a variety of different things, in this context, access means that a design condition under which a place, product, or service can be used by people with disabilities. But what does it really mean when we say that a building claims to be accessible? Does it have ramps or elevators, braille, or convenient parking spots? Uh, Answer is that nobody knows. In today's world, the idea of access is not enough because access needs are personal. Let me explain. So here's me and two of my friends, Elizabeth, who is a power chair user, and my friend Brianne, who has autism and ADHD or ADHD. We all have very different needs and interact with space differently. So for example, tactile paving is meant to be helpful for somebody who's blind, like myself, because it serves as a navigational tool, but it hinders Elizabeth because her wheels don't work as well over bumpy surfaces. And Elizabeth needs wide open spaces to maneuver her power chair, but Brianne is overwhelmed by the immense amounts of sound and stimuli that come with larger spaces. And Brianne prefers soft and muted color palettes that allow her to focus, but for me, it just means everything sort of blends together and I end up running into things. So, with all of these conflicting needs, how do you design buildings for access? Because some features that help certain disabled users inherently harm others, universally accessible architecture isn't real. That means by labeling a building as accessible, it just creates a system where no one knows what to expect when you go inside a public space. So the problem with the current design paradigm is that we are trying to make buildings that are accessible to all, which isn't a realistic design goal. So how should we design instead? I don't believe that there is a right or wrong way to design something, but I have spent the past year grappling with what I want my own design practice to look like through developing my thesis and starting a social enterprise, both entitled Remarcation. My paradigm isn't perfect, but I have some tenets that help guide my design practice. The first being that no space has or is or ever will be accessible to all people. Designers should understand who they are excluding and be held accountable. Exclusion is inevitable, even if it's undesirable. And instead of brushing these thoughts aside in favor of attempting to be as accessible as possible, it is important to work towards alternative ways of access. This is particularly problematic because, again, as we stated, disabled people are very common. The World Health Organization estimates that 1 in every 6 people is disabled, with the number only increasing as time goes on. However, 70% of disabled users have reported to have gone to a public building only upon arrival realizing they could not access it. That's almost a billion people who will experience access exclusion. This is in part due to a lack of accessible buildings, but it's also because we pretend that we can make universal spaces. Say you're somebody with access needs and you have a choice between 4 different banks, right? If you choose one and you can't access, you've just wasted your time, energy, and money. It turns going out into the public as a gamble. If instead we were able to acknowledge which spaces are and aren't accessible to people of different abilities, we can eliminate the mental load of guessing where to go. Second, the built world has a hierarchy of accessibility for different users. But I believe that the hierarchy will never be eliminated, and instead, we must shift it to prioritize users based on need. In our current reality, we prioritize able bodied users and deprioritize disabled users. In an ideal world, all people will be prioritized equally. However, because access needs are often contradictory, there will always be features that will both benefit and hinder specific user groups, leading to advantages and disadvantages depending on the user and the space. I am proposing that we keep the hierarchy because it will never be eliminated, but instead of keeping the status quo, we remake it into a hierarchy of needs. For example, if we imagine a raised entrance to a building, we can either make a ramp or a stair, right? Traditionally, we have used stairs and then provided an accessible entrance around the back or on the side. In the scenario with the stairs, able bodied people are able to access the building, but people with mobility impairments cannot. However, there is nothing preventing able bodied people from using a ramp. It just may be inconvenient because it takes like 5 seconds longer. But in this case, I would argue that it's more important for people with mobility disabilities to be able to access the building at all, compared to the slight inconvenience for those who would have just walked up the stairs. In this case, we have switched the hierarchy. The priority goes to the group who needs it most. And this doesn't necessarily have to be used in accessibility context. For example, a designer may have the choice of putting in bathrooms for two genders or bathrooms that cater to all genders. In this case, cisgender people may feel more comfortable if they do not have to share bathrooms with a different gender. But as research has shown, people who are trans or non binary are 4 times more likely than people who are cisgender to experience violence in a bathroom. Thus, because the risk is much higher for people of non binary gender, the priority should go towards all gender bathrooms. Finally, there is no objectivity in the way in which individuals experience space, as no two people have the exact same access needs. However, empirical measurements of the environment can allow for specificity and personalization. One of the problems with the way that we design now is that we assume that design has to account for everyone's needs, which we know is impossible. However, if we give disabled people the information they need about public spaces, combined with their knowledge of their own needs, it allows users to make their own decisions on what spaces are accessible for them. This is where the disabled narrative comes in. So long, so long as designers, we've seen ourselves as problem solvers and innovators. But the truth is, we can't fix everything through design. And giving autonomy back to users, especially to disabled users, is an important step in making sure that people feel respected and valued. So, in conclusion, universal access is not a realistic goal, and therefore we must provide better information so that disabled users can confidently navigate public space. So, in order to do this, I developed a preliminary set of metrics using my knowledge about architecture and disability. I compiled a list of over 20 environmental features that I knew intersected with access. I tried to make them as objective as possible so that it didn't feel like a subjective experience when rating, only a subjective experience in describing one's own access needs. I separated the factors into 4 categories, the first being visual perception, as it's the most dominant sense through which we observe the world. Each factor in this category exists on a spectrum to allow for a nuance in the built environment. One of the most important things to notice about these metrics as the scales do not operate from good to bad, by which I mean accessible to inaccessible. In much of access practice today, we are always seeking quote unquote better solutions. However, as we know, certain things that are better for certain individuals make it more difficult for others. Because of this, it is important for me to specify that these scales are not passing judgment on a space, but rather just as an empirical metric which people can use to map out their own experience to determine accessibility for themselves. One of my advisors once compared this to the idea of nutrition facts. He called it nutrition facts for buildings, where nutrition facts are not meant to tell you whether or not you should consume a certain product, but rather it just informs you of the values of the nutritional contents, and then you make the judgment for yourself about whether or not you want to eat it. Ideally, in the way that companies make foods for all types of diets, so too could we as designers make buildings that cater to all types of people. So, if we take glass, for example, glass can be both a positive and a negative building feature. Implications on space is a particular instance in which conflicting needs arise based on physical condition. So, glass has become so important in architecture because it facilitates access, particularly that of visual access. So, for individuals who may rely on sight to communicate or otherwise situate themselves, like those who are hard of hearing or who are deaf, glass is incredibly beneficial because it allows for a larger field of view that is possible with solid partitions. However, transparency also makes glass dangerous. As users, but especially those with visual impairments like myself, we are more likely to run into glass because we can't see it. This has become more common with floor to ceiling glass partitions. If anyone remembers, in 2019, Apple unveiled their new campus with plenty of uh, floor to ceiling glass walls. And they made it into the news for the frequency of injuries to employees running into the glass walls, which subsequently resulted in Apple just placing stickers on the walls so that people wouldn't run into them. In comparison to visual perception, other sensory perception has fewer metrics, not because there are inherently less factors that influence it, but because sight as a sense is so dominant that other senses get ignored. However, there are dozens of factors we don't quote unquote see that influence the way we experience space, including temperature, humidity, sound, texture, and smell. Because this category is so broad, I think it also affects the most diverse types of users. So tactility is important to those who have visual impairments. Uneven ground surface usually affects those with mobility devices, and ambient odor and volume can affect those with autism or other invisible disabilities. While visual and other sensory perception metrics are more focused on way users experience space, spatial conditions are more focused on the environment and how it can aid or hinder access. This category is very broad in the sense that it references so many different spatial aspects, but the thing that they all have in common is that they have direct interference or contact with users rather than just being decorative or ornamental elements of architecture. So the list of spatial conditions is also tailored to experience architects may not envision when creating space. So for example, a designer may think about claustrophobic or crowded spaces when you think about occupancy limits for emergency exits. But you don't necessarily think about what the experience is to be surrounded by a bunch of people. Or with spaces of rest, architects are required to think about travel distance when you need to find an emergency exit, but they neglect thinking about the bodily experience of moving through space and how it may affect someone's energy or endurance. The goal is not to increase the amount of factors that designers need to consider, but rather for them to understand that the concepts they're already using can affect users in more ways than they could have imagined. The last category is accessibility aids, which is arguably the most simple, but also the most extensive. So the categories I came up with were door assistance, height diverse furniture, navigation aids, duplicated written and auditory instructions, translation services, and Braille. But as technology gets more and more sophisticated, there are plenty of new features, including visual fire alarms, AI translators, and bathroom fall detection. Ultimately, my initial list has been a test, and metrics can be added, swapped, or removed as they prove their usefulness. So the conclusion of my thesis was that all minds and bodies can thrive in public if we foster autonomy of users through information justice. Okay, great, love that. But how does it look in the real world? Well, I'm so glad you asked. So Remarcation as an organization has three main goals. Community building to ensure the usefulness of our framework, self-sufficiency to ensure we have a feedback loop to constantly update our work, and impact diversification so that the data can be used beyond our purposes and make the world more accessible. First, we wanted to verify that we were providing value to and doing right by the disabled community. So I developed the remarcation framework and held workshops with disabled Harvard students, over 80% of whom strongly agreed that they would feel more confident if they had better accessibility information. Using my list of accessibility factors, participants were able to choose 5 or more metrics that they felt were relevant to their access needs and describe where on the spectrum those metrics, where on the spectrum of those metrics their access needs would be met. In addition, in discussion, all participants were able to describe how each metric affected their experience in the sample space and what they liked and disliked about the space needed for those factors. The next goal is to gather and disseminate information as efficiently and accurately as possible. So for a long time, there were many questions of how we would gather the data. Originally, I had wanted all the data to be crowdsourced, like in order to remain true to the idea of user autonomy. But when I pitched this to investors, they often expressed concern about the variability and subjectivity of crowdsourcing, often suggesting that I moderate these results with AI or did something entirely different. Eventually, we decided to hire a team of disabled designers who are experts in their field to evaluate the spaces initially, and then users would be able to report discrepancies between the metrics and their experience as a happy medium. In addition to my personal research, a series of independent studies has also shown that 71% of users would want an app with accessibility data, and 66% are willing to contribute that information. And so, Remarcation is designing an app that does both. First, users create access profiles specifying their unique needs across environmental factors like lighting or mobility. Second, users can view how a location's environmental factors match their access needs. For example, Elizabeth may see how Smith matches her mobility needs for an even ground surface. Finally, the app leverages the power and passion of the community by allowing users to evaluate a space in a similar fashion to choosing their access needs. So they would pick a category, then provide quantitative and qualitative access. Even though the data is provided through our experts first, the ongoing feedback loop can inform us if there have been any changes to the space or if the community perceives the space differently than we initially saw it. And the most important thing for me was that this interface and access to our data would always be free for users. And it could work seamlessly with other navigational apps. This was a question I got a lot when I was pitching to investors to see how we would differentiate ourselves from existing navigational apps. But right now, there isn't enough description around access when we look up public spaces. Remarcation aims to change that through the personalization of factors. Our information is meant to be used in conjunction with these apps to supplement a user's experience with information that doesn't currently exist. So, in the same way that Yelp supplements a navigational app with detailed business reviews, or in the way that Waze supplements a navigational app with crowdsourced traffic data, our goal was to work in conjunction to provide accessibility information. So, while I have emphasized the importance of understanding the current landscape of accessibility and delivering information justice, it is through design work that we will begin to change the built environment for the better. We can use the information gathered from both our designers and our users to see what features are and are not working for them, and brainstorm ways that we can make both short-term access alternatives and long-term access improvements. The other method through which we plan on expanding impact is through the use of our data. After amassing a large enough data set for access features of public buildings, we believe we can give this information to cultural institutions, local businesses, and even other designers so that they can have a more comprehensive understanding of the state of access and draw their own conclusions on how to improve upon it, further diversifying the types of access across the built environment. Finally, I wanted to end on this quote by Toni Morrison. I believe that accessibility is power. And by using power to empower others, we can create a future where access is no longer a privilege, but a fundamental right. By sharing accessibility information, we empower disabled people to navigate the world with confidence and certainty, letting them define their own narratives. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Hannah. So you're
Thanks, Don.
taking your design accessibility and putting it into smartphone.
Mhm.
Can a one-handed person easily use a smartphone?
I suppose. Well, okay. Let me dissect this question a little bit. So that is something that we really considered, the idea of the access of the delivery method, right? Like, not only does the information need to be about accessibility, but the information itself has to be accessible. And so thinking about somebody who uses a smartphone with one hand, maybe you're right. Maybe the smartphone isn't the best delivery method. But I do think there are alternate ways of delivering the same information. Maybe, me and my team just have to think about, like, okay, maybe is it better to do it on a browser? Is it better to have it I don't know, in kind of like a web content form? Is it better to kind of have it be able to, I don't know, dictate or use text to speech? I think there is an inherent problem with assuming that this solution would be suitable for everybody. I don't claim to that this system will work for everybody, but I do hope that, for the people that it that it does serve, that it will be helpful.
Thanks very much. I'm going to read a question from the chat. Anthony Lowe would like to know, how do you decide as a designer what groups you will exclude? Is it based on the desired program or something that develops over time from community involvement?
Yeah, I don't think people choose to exclude groups. I don't think, well, my goal is not to tell you that you should design by excluding groups, but I do feel like generally as designers, we do research to make, designs for our clients. And so generally those types of people are prioritized. And so after doing ethnographic research or other research, I feel that you generally end up with a specific type or a specific subset of a population. And then I would say yes, that the idea of who gets excluded comes from just the nature of what access needs are not met, like for people who are in the group that you're designing for. And so I do think it is one of those things that you can't, in some ways, I think it's something that you can't anticipate and that you have to think about otherwise. But I think it also has to do with understanding the diversity of access needs and then thinking about, okay, how do you create workarounds that are either easier than the design process or are either easier to kind of post rationalize and think about.
Great. And then Rowena comments that gamers have simulated environment modules that can be modified for 5 sensory adaptations. Why are we still speaking of stairs? Rowena believes that the future has no stairs.
Look, I hate a stairmaster. I'd love a future without stairs. Uh, but I do think there is something that's very interesting with regards to video game design. A lot of video game design focuses on natural tendencies toward circulation and navigation. So the idea of directing light in certain areas to draw a character forward or to instruct someone where to go, I think like is incredibly interesting and valuable as, for the design profession. And I agree that there are industries that are much farther ahead of us in terms of understanding access and understanding multisensory perception. And like, I am happy to be learning from them.